It was now quite light in the room. Then the door of the bedroom opened, and Mr. Samsa appeared in his uniform with his wife on one arm and his daughter on the other. All of them had been crying a little. Greet now and then pressed her face against her father's arm. "Leave my home, now," said Mr. Samsa, indicating the door and without letting the women from him. "What do you mean?" asked the middle of the three gentlemen, and somewhat disconcerted. And he smiled sweetly. The other two held their hands behind their backs and continually rubbed them together in gleeful anticipation of a loud quarrel which could only end in their favor. "I mean just what I said," answered Mr. Samsa, and with his two companions went straight line toward the man. At first he stood there still, looking at the ground as if the contents of his head were rearranging themselves into new positions. "All right, we go then," he said, and looked up at Mr. Samsa as if he had been suddenly overcome with humility and wanted to give permission again from Mr. Samsa for his decision. Mr. Samsa merely opened his eyes wide and briefly nodded to him several times. At that, and without delay, the man actually did take long strides in the front hallway. His two friends had stopped rubbing their hands some time before and had been listening to what had been being said. Now they jumped off after their friend as if taken with a sudden fear that Mr. Samsa might go out into the hallway in front of them and break the connection with their leader. Once there, all three took their hats from the stand, took their sticks from the holder, bowed without a word, and left the premises. Mr. Samsa and the two women followed them out into the landing. But they had no reason to mistrust the men's intentions, and they leaned over the landing as they saw how three gentlemen made slow but steady progress down the many steps. As they turned the corner on each floor, they disappeared and would reappear a few moments later. The further down they went, the more the Samsa family lost interest in them, when the butcher's boy, proud of the posture with his tray on his head, passed them on his way up and came nearer than they were. Mr. Samsa and the women came away from the landing and went, as if relieved, back into the flat. They decided the best way to make use of the day was for relaxation and go for a walk. Not only had they earned a break from work, but they were in serious need of it. So they'd sat at the table and wrote 3 letters of excusal. Mr. Samsa to his employers, Mrs. Samsa to her contractors, and Greet to her principal. The cleaner came in while they were still writing to tell them that she was going. She'd finished her work for that morning. The 3 of them at first nodded without looking up from what they were writing, and it was only when the cleaner still did not seem to want to leave that they looked up in irritation. "Well?" asked Mr. Samsa. The charwoman stood at the doorway with a smile on her face as if she had come tremendous news to report, but only do it if she was clearly asked to. The almost vertical little ostrich feather on her hat, which had been a source of irritation to Mr. Samsa for all the time she had been working for them, swayed gently in all directions. "What is it you want, then?" asked Mrs. Samsa, whom the cleaner had the most respect for. "Yes," she answered, and broke into a friendly laugh that made her unable to speak straight away. "Well, then, that thing in there, you shouldn't need worry about how you're going to get rid of it. That's all been sorted out." Mrs. Samsa and Greet bent down over their letters as if intent on continuing with what they were writing. Mr. Samsa saw that the cleaner wanted to start describing everything in detail, but with outstretched hand he made quite clear that she was not to. So, as she was prevented from telling them all about it, she suddenly remembered what a hurry she was in, and clearly peeved, called out, "Cheerio, then, everyone," turned around sharply and left, slamming the door terribly as she went. "Tonight she gets sacked," said Mr. Samsa, but he had received no reply from either his wife or daughter, as the charwoman seemed to have destroyed the peace they had only just gained. They got up and went over to the window where they remained, with their little arms round each other. Mr. Samsa twisted round in his chair to look at them, and sat there watching for a while. Then he called out, "Come here, then. Let's forget all about that stuff, shall we? Come and give me a little bit of attention." The 2 women immediately did as he said, hurrying over to him where they kissed him and hugged him, and then quickly finished their letters. After that, the 3 of them left the flat together, which was something they had not done for months, and took the tram out to the open country outside of town. They had the tram filled with warm sunshine all to themselves. Leant back comfortably on their seats, they discussed the prospects and found on closer examination they were not all bad. Until then they had never asked each other about their work, but all 3 had jobs which were very good and held particularly good promise for the future. The greatest improvement for the time being, of course, would be achieved easily by the moving house. What they needed now was a flat that was smaller and cheaper than the current one which had been chosen by Gregor, one that was in a better location and, most of all, more practical. All the time Greet was becoming livelier. With all the worry they had been having of late, her cheeks had become pale, but while they were talking, Mr. and Mrs. Samsa were struck, almost simultaneously, with the thought of how their daughter was blossoming into a well-built and beautiful young lady. They became quieter. Just from each other's glance, and almost without knowing it, they agreed that it would soon be time to find a good man for her. And, as if in confirmation of their new dreams and good intentions, as soon as they reached their destination, Greet was the first to get up and stretch out her young body.